All right, everyone, Zoom, you still hear me all right? Excellent. All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. So good to be back by the Tzaddik. Wow. Hashem, you don't realize sometimes how much you miss something until you have it back. Okay, so anyway, so we'll say let's go back to begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Stephen Terry Zinn, in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zinn, Bunim Tzvi Ben Chaim Zichron Livracha, on the occasion of his 20th yard site. Our week of learning sponsors, Keely and Jillian Goldberger, as a zchus for an easy and successful surgery for their son Aaron. Aaron Yeshaya Ben Rivka Esther. Aaron is having surgery right now as we speak. We hope that in the merits, precious little boy, in merits Hashem, the surgery should be successful, and Chodesh Baruch Hu should grant him a long life filled with Hatzlacha, Refuah, Yeshua, and Nechama. Our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, an anonymous sponsorship in the Schus of Besoros Tovos and the healthy mother and baby for Sarah Miriam Bas Shulamis Chana. And Daf Yomi sponsorship, Ayal and Sarah Steinberg, in the Schus of continued health for Shulamis Chana Bas Susha, and for an ultimate and enduring refuah. And of course, we dedicate our learning in the schools of all of Klal Yisrael. The Kodesh Baruch Hu should continue to shower us with bracha, hatzlacha, Yeshua, Nechama, Besoros Tovos, for Am Yisrael and for Eretz Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Actually, really not that much to do, so you got a little bit of a tzaddik. So today's daf is Nun. We are picking up in Yirtzeh Hashem on Mem Tes Amud Beis, and we literally left off last line on Mem Tes Amud Beis, 49b, last night. Suppose if you remember again, the Gemara yesterday went on an interesting, not a tangent, but a side discussion. That side discussion is going to be the primary discussion for today's daf, which is, remember again, about say what we established in yesterday's daf was we established that halacha l'maisa, an ola has shchita and kabbalah in the north, Ichatos has shchita and kabbalah in the north, and in Asham has shchita and kabbalah in the north. Now, interestingly enough, what else we saw was that the din of Tzafan, the din of north, was actually brought down in the context of Ola. And everything else is extrapolated from there. That then led the Gemara on an interesting discussion about when you learn something out from a drasha, can that item then serve as the source for another drasha? So this was very common because remember again, we were doing this, we learn out, for example, chatas from Ola, right? So Ola has to be shechted and Kabbalah in the north, so we learn out chatas from that. Can chatas then serve as a source for something else? So this led actually to a pretty involved conversation where the Gemara was going through the multiple iterations of this question. So that's what we're picking up with today. So last line, Mem Tes Amud Beis 49b. Davar halamid mehekish. So we'll say, for example, let's say you have something that's learned out from a hekish. Hekish means a comparison. A comparison. So can that item, chozer umalamid b'kal v'chomer, can that item, that derived item, then serve as the source of a kal v'chomer? So we'll say, so just remember using our ABC mashal as we saw in yesterday's daf. So let's say, for example, I learn out B from A with a hekish, a halachic comparison. Can I then use B in a kal v'chomer with C? Right? Now, what's the underlying question? The underlying question is, can something which is a derivative at any point serve as a source for another halacha? That's really the fundamental underlying question. The Gemara is just going to ask it in a whole million different ways, depending on the exegetical or derivative method that you are using, right? So therefore, if I learn out the halacha of B from A by dint of a hekish, of a comparison, can B then be used with C as part of a kal v'chomer? That's the shayla. So the Gemara says, well, let's take a look, top of Nun, 50a. V'detar Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel actually, right, as they talk about, right, Rabbi Shmuel, Davar halamid behekish, mahu shi lamid bebinyan av. So Rabbi Shmuel asks a little bit of a different question. He says, if something's learned out from a hekish, right, B is learned out from Hay with a hekish, with a comparison. Can B then go ahead and serve as what we call a binyan av? Binyan av, Rabbi says, is the concept of a paradigm. That's why we loosely translate a paradigm. Can be then served as a paradigm, ultimately again for C, I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah says, well, let's analyze this. Lo lichtov tzafona ba'asham v'tisi mi binyan av mechatos. Well, on one hand, we could have said like this. The Torah didn't have to write tzafon, didn't have to write anything about the north when it comes to asham, and go ahead and learn it out from a binyan av from chatos. Okay, so the Gemara says, Lamai hilchos hakasei. So let's hear this again. So the Torah didn't have to say tzafon by asham. Wasn't necessary. And I could have learned it out of a binyan av from a paradigm from chatos. What would have been the binyan av? It would have been just like chatos, which ultimately again atones, is a sin offering, requires tzafon, so too every sin offering requires tzafon. And that would have included asham. And there would have been no need for the Torah to write anything by asham. So why did the Torah write the tzafon obligation by asham? Lav lememra must be to teach us davar halamid behekish ein choser umalamid bebinyanav. It must be to teach us that something that is learned out through a comparison ultimately can't serve as a source for a binyan av. Right? So we'll see here. This is actually very interesting logic. Had the Torah not written anything by asham, I would have said like this. Just like chatos requires tzafon, so chatos is a paradigm. Any sin offering requires tzafon. What else is included in sin offerings? Asham. Now, we'll say, now how did I learn out, where do I know that chatos is chayiv in tzafon? Where do I know that from? Ultimately, hekish to ola. So therefore, again, that would have effectively been chatos, which is learned out from a hekish, from a comparison to ola, that it requires tzafon. And now, chatos becomes the binyan of the paradigm, ultimately for asham. So had the Torah not written a north requirement by asham, I could have learned it out from chatos to asham. So chatos learned out from ola through a hekish, and then chatos serves as a binyan of a paradigm to asham. Now, the fact that the Torah did write the north obligation by asham, why did the Torah do that? It must be to teach you lamai hilchos hakasvei. So why? Fourth line down on 50a. So why did the Torah write the north obligation ultimately begin by asham? Lav lememra masi, to teach me davar halamid behekish ein choser umalamid bebinyanav. The only reason that the Torah included the north obligation by asham must be to teach me that halacha lemaisa, something that is learned out by a hekish, cannot serve as a paradigm for something else. Okay, so that seems to answer the question. So Gemara says, 1 second, hold up. Well, so I don't understand. Gemara says, guys, a little bit on a detour. So Gemara says, I don't understand. Well, the truth is, why do you even need chatas at all? Why can't you ultimately just learn out asham from a binyan av, from a paradigm, ultimately again, of ola, to which the Gemara says, just like ola requires tzafon, so to asham requires tzafon. My time lo asi. So why is it that we don't learn out? Why is it that we don't learn out asham from ola? Mishum de'ika lemifrach. Ultimately, again, because there's a pircha. What's the pircha? The Gemara says, what's the question on that hekish? Mala ola shekain kalil. Ola can't serve as the paradigm ultimately again for asham. Why? Because ola is a separate and distinct carbon. What's unique about ola? It's totally consumed on the mizbeach. That stands in contradistinction ultimately again to asham, which is not. The Gemara says, well, 1 second. So why does it make it any better to learn out asham from chatos? Chatos nami ikal mifrach. I could ask a pircha on chatos also. What's the pircha? Mal chatos shekin mechayeves shekin mechaperes al krisos. Chatos is also, we keep bringing this up, by the way. Chatos is unique. What makes chatos unique? Chatos is mechaper on chayve krisos. That if you do something, let's remember again, what is a chatos mechaper for? Any infraction, which if done intentionally would be chayiv kares, if done unintentionally, you bring a chatos. We'll say that's a pretty powerful carbon. So perhaps again, chatos can't serve as the paradigm for anything. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Chada mechada lo asya. The truth is, we'll say, so now I just want to point out just what happened over here, just to follow the train of thought, because it's actually not complex, just a lot of steps. We're asking an exegetical question, right? What's our exegetical question? If B is learned out from A by means of a hekesh, a comparison, can B serve as the source of a kal v'chomer for C, right? That's what we're asking. So the Gemara says, well, we had a different question. Rabbi Shmuel said, that's a little bit differently. If B is learned out from A by way of a hekish, can be then serve as a binyan av, as a paradigm for C. Which is a little bit of a different question, but same basic idea, that if B is a derivative, can B serve as a source? So the Gemara says, so the Gemara answers, well, let's take a look at this case, right? The Gemara says, let's learn out that there's an obligation of Asham, ultimately again, from Chatos. Just like Chatos, that there's an obligation of Safon, obligation of North, just like Chatos ultimately again has an obligation of North, so too Asham has an obligation of North as well, through ultimately again a binyan av. Now, where's Chatas itself learned out from? Chatas is learned out from Ola. So be Chatas learned out from Ola by means of a Hekish, and then Chatas also ultimately serves as a binyan av for Asham. Now, the fact that the Torah goes out of its way to write a North obligation by Asham indicates to us that we don't want to use that mechanism. Right? Because otherwise the Torah could have omitted a northern statement by Asham and learned it out by means of this limud. The fact that the Torah goes out of its way to state north obligation by Asham indicates to us that we do not want to use Chatas as a binyan av, because Chatas is learned out from a Hekish to Ola. To which the Gemara just essentially answers, well, maybe not. Maybe at the end of the day, Chatas is just unique because it's mechaper ultimately again, Chayve Krisos. Ola is unique ultimately because it's totally consumed on the Mizbeach. That's why the Torah had to go out of its way to write Safon, a north obligation by Asham. To which the Gemara says, okay, so now we'll say essentially what we have over here in front of us are three karbanos, ultimately again with a north obligation, or three categories of karbanos. I've got Ola, Chatas, Asham. All of them have the same north obligation. So the Gemara says, Chada mechada lo asya. No one of these could have been directly derived from one other. In other words, right, you hear that? Like, you can't derive Chatas from Ola, Asham from Ola, Asham from Chatas, or Asham from Ola, right? So in other words, I can't, and Ola I don't need to derive anything, because remember again, Ola, the Torah writes it explicitly over there. So I can't derive one from one. But the Gemara says, maybe, Chadamitarti, maybe instead of going ahead and having to learn out all three, we can just go ahead and learn out two and learn out the third, ultimately again from the two that are darshan. So the Gemara says, so how should we do this? Lo nichtov rachmana Ola. So let the Torah not make any mention of Ola, of a tzafon, of a northern obligation by Ola. V'tisi mechatas va'asham. And I would have said instead, once we know that chatas and asham have a north obligation, then I would say that Ola has a tzafon, a north obligation as well. The Gemara says that's not going to work. Why not? Because Chatas and Asham are unique. Or I should say, what makes them unique above Ola? They're mechaper. They atone. They're sin offerings. Therefore, they affect atonement. So therefore, if we would have just learned out a tzafon obligation by Chatas and Asham, I would have said atonement karbanos have a tzafon obligation, but lav dafka that I know anything by Ola. So don't say anything by Chatos and learn out the northern obligation, ultimately again of Chatos, from Ola and Asham. That's not going to work. Ultimately again because Ola and Asham are male animals, whereas the Chatos can be male or female. Okay, lo nichtov ba'asham. So don't say anything by Asham and learn it out from a Chatas and an Ola. Here's the Rebbe said that both Chatas and Ola, ultimately again, there is a communal version of this carbon, which Asham does not have. So rather, we'll say, what do we say? So therefore, again, we'll say, therefore, the Gemara says it doesn't work. This whole thing ultimately again doesn't work. So therefore, we'll say, interestingly enough, it does sound like halacha l'maisa. You can go ahead and take something that was learned out from a hekish and go ahead and use it. The Gemara doesn't answer for kal v'chomer, but at least ultimately again for a binyan av. Okay, so that's category one. Now, both say, I just want to tell you the backdrop to this is a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, which we ended off yesterday's daf with. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? Rabbi Yochanan said in general, B'chala Torah kula, throughout the entire Torah, L'meidin lamad milamed. In general, Rabbi Yochanan says, in Kala Torah kula, you could use a derivative halacha as a source for something else. The only place you can't do this is kachim. Now, our Gemara now is disagreeing with that a little bit, right? Our Gemara seems to be analyzing the possibility that halacha l'maisa, you can use derivatives to use as source. We're going to reconcile that in a little while. Next, I will say, by the way, I just want to point out, well, let's go a little bit later. So next, next question. What about something that has learned that from Gzera Shava? So let's say B is learned out from A, is derived from A through use of Gzera Shava. Okay, what's the halacha? Ma'ashi lamid b'hekesh. Can then B be used as a source for C with a hekesh, with a comparison? Amar Papa says, "V'zos Toras Zevach Hashlamim Imal Toda." So the pasuk says, literally, "V'zos Toras Zevach Hashlamim." This is the halacha of Shlamim. Asher yakriv la'Hashem im al Toda yakrivenu. So after the Torah speaks about Shlamim, the Torah next pasuk literally speaks about carbon Toda. Lamadu, listen to this. Lamadu Toda sheba min hamaiser. So interestingly enough, the halacha is actually a fascinating halacha that a carbon Toda can be brought from Meiser Sheni. Came brought from Meiser Sheni. So if you have a Meiser Sheni animal, ultimately, again, you could go ahead and bring a carbon Toda from that. Take a look at Rashi. Lamadu Toda, it's a bit above. If you go across to the right in Rashi, maybe about 10 lines up. So Rashi says, Lamadu Toda, Mikan behekesh mishlamim, sheba min ha-meiser, im perish b'shas nidro, al manas lahavi mimaos Meiser Sheni. So as I say, interestingly enough, a carbon Toda can be brought from Meiser Sheni. Just a fascinating halacha. And Rashi points out over here, this only works if you do it at the time, if you stipulate this at the time that you make the neder to bring the carbon Toda. Okay, interesting. Sigmar says, Mida'ashkichan shlamim da'asu mimaiser, because we'll say, since we find that shlamim can be brought from Meiser Sheni, and shlamim, Sigmar says, and remember, so what's the idea? Since shlamim can be brought from Meiser Sheni, and carbon Toda is juxtaposed to shlamim. Therefore, just like shlamim can be brought from Meiser Sheni, so too carbon Toda can be brought from Meiser Sheni as well. To which the Gemara says, well, hold up here. Shlamim gufayhu minavan. How do you know that a carbon shlamim can be brought from Meiser Sheni? So I just want to point out what this means. It's actually very interesting. Remember, what's Meiser Sheni? Mosai. Meiser Sheni is on your produce, right? So what do? I have produce. Baruch Hashem, I live in Eretz Yisrael. I live in Tel Aviv. I don't want to take all of my produce with me to Yerushalayim. So what do? I redeem it onto money. I take the money to Yerushalayim. Now what the Gemara is telling me is, watch this. I could take my money when I'm in Yerushalayim, and I could use the money to buy a carbon shlamim. Not only that, I could also use the money to buy a carbon Toda. Now, why can I buy? Because now the Gemara is like this. Since I could use money to buy carbon shlamim, and carbon Toda is juxtaposed ultimately again to shlamim, that just like you could use Meiser Sheni for a shlamim, you could use Meiser Sheni money for a Toda. Beautiful. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second. How do you know that you're allowed to use Meiser Sheni money for shlamim? Where did you get that from? To which the Gemara says, Dechsiv, because the Gemara says, Sham. It's Gzera Shava. It's Gzera Shava. Ultimately, again, it says Sham in the context of Shlamim, and it says Sham in the context, ultimately, again, of Meiser Sheni. So both say, you see what happened over here? So the Gemara just went ahead and learned out that Shlamim can be brought from Meiser Sheni with Gzera Shava, and then used shlamim ultimately again as a hekish, as a comparison to carbon Toda, right? Since shlamim is juxtaposed to carbon Toda, just like shlamim ultimately again can be brought from Meiser Sheni, so too Toda can be brought from Meiser Sheni. So incredible. So what is this an example of? This is an example ultimately again of a derivative halacha being used as a hekish or something else. So remember, shlamim is learned out from a Gzera Shava, ultimately again to Meiser Sheni, and then the juxtaposition of shlamim to Toda tells me that just like shlamim can be bought with Meiser Sheni money, so too Toda can be bought with Meiser Sheni money. Incredible. So just an example of the use of this exegetical method. Meiser, it's not really a good comparison, I'll tell you why. Meiser dagan chulin ba'almo. Again, I will say, remember again, we're asking this question in the context of Kadshim. Right? All these exegetical questions are exegetical questions dafka asked in the context of Kadshim, to which the Gemara says, Meiser Sheni is chulin. Right? In other words, it's a designation ultimately again on unconsecrated produce. So that's not really helpful to our particular question, right? Our question at hand ultimately again is the use of derivative halachas in Kadshim law. But Meiser Sheni is not really Kachim law. Meiser Sheni is much more considered to be Chulin, to which the Gemara says, Amar Amra, Lamad Kodesh, Umalamid Kodesh, to which he answered, remember, that's not true. As long as one of the derivatives in the equation is Karbanos, is Kachim, then that satisfies the criteria of our inquiry, right? What we're asking about say is, can a derivative halacha serve as a source halacha in the realm of Kachim? As long as one of the sides of the equation, right, either A or C is dealing with Kachim, that satisfies the criteria for our inquiry and is on point. Okay, so everyone will say, interesting, I just want to point out, so it sounds like what the Gemara is saying is something, right, if B is learned out from A by dint of a gzera shava, B can serve as the source of a hekish with C, right? How do we know that? Because shlamim, we learn out that shlamim is able to be brought from Meiser Sheni through a gzera shava with Meiser Sheni. So shlamim is the B, Meiser Sheni is the A, and then shlamim serves as the comparison by dint of the juxtaposition to shlamim. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Shlamim is learned out from Meiser Sheni, and then again through a gzera shava. And then Toda is juxtaposed to Shlamim. So there's a Hekish over there. So you see from here that Shlamim is learned out from Gzera Shava and then serves as a Hekish ultimately again to carbon Toda. Incredible. Let's go right there. Davar Halamim B'Gzera Shava, Ma'ashilam B'Gzera Shava. I was about to say, I think ask a different question. What if B is learned out from A through a Gzera Shava? Could B then serve as the source or as part of a Gzera Shava with C? That's the Shaila. We learn this solas merbeches lamanu l'revuka sheba solas. So both say again. The pasuk over here says solas merbeches. Now both say now again talking about this. Actually, carbon toda is brought with 40 different loaves. 40 different loaves, right, of different types. So one of the loaves that's brought is what's called a scalded loaf. Scalded loaf, so it's made like with boiling water. So the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, this revuka, which is what we call this scalded loaf, is brought with soles. And we'll say, now what's soles? Fine flour. Chalos minayin. How do I know that the loaves called chalos, which is just another type of loaf of the carbon toda, is also brought with soles? Talmud lomar, chalos, gzer shava, chalos. Rikike minayin. How do I know that we call the wafer loaves? Those are also brought with soles. These are all different loaves of the carbon toda. Minayin, Talmud lomar, matzos. Ultimately, again, Gzera Shava. So what you see over here is ultimately, again, a two-tier Gzera Shava. So again, B is being learned out from A with the Gzera Shava, then being used as part of a Gzera Shava with C. So it sounds like even something learned out with the Gzera Shava could serve as part of the Gzera Shava with something else. Amar Rabina, Mimai de matzos, mechalos gamer. How do you know ultimately again that the Gzera Shava of matzos is built on chalos? Dilma mima'afet tanur gamra. Maybe actually it's being learned out from a general carbon mincha and not from carbon toda at all. Therefore, again, I will say halacha l'maisa, it's not a raya. So Ella Amar Rava, rather Rava said Tanya. It's actually very interesting. We learned, I will say this is by the power of the Kohen Gadol. By the power of the Kohen Gadol. So we learned Tanya the kirbo. So the pasuk over here says as follows: the kirbo upirsho. So kirbo said, now literally kirbo means it's kishkas. It's inside of the carbon. Upirsho. Pirsho means any waste that is inside of the animal. And again, remember, by the power of the Kohen Gadol, it's very unique. What happens? Shchita, Kabbalah, Zrika, done inside of the Beis HaMikdash. But then the animal, the intact animal, is actually taken outside and burnt outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So the Torah says over here, kirba or pirsha hosi. The insides, the kishkas of the animal, and any waste inside of the animal remains inside of the animal, and you take it out to be burned. Which I will say is another way of saying what? Another way of saying is we don't cut up the animal inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Right? We don't take it out. We shacht it, we get the blood, and then we take it out fully intact to be burned. Malamed shemotzio shalim. This teaches us that halacha l'maisa, you take the animal out complete, right, intact, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately again to burn it. Yachol yisrafenu shalim. So you might have thought ultimately again that we burn it intact also. Now what does that mean? I might have thought that maybe there's no removal of sacrificial parts, right? And that we burn the whole thing intact. Ne'emar kan rosha ukrav. It says over here, its head and its insides. V'ne'emar lahalon rosha ukrav. And it says by an ola rosha ukrav as well. Ma lahalon ayideni tuach. Just like again by the ola, obviously the sacrificial parts are removed. Afkan ayideni ta'ituach. So to over here, ultimately, the sacrificial parts are removed as well. Imal halon behefshit, afkanai behefshit. So you might have thought that just like by the ola, the animal is flayed, right? It's skinned. So to over here by the par kohen gadol, it should be skinned as well. Talmud lomar ukirba upirsho. Therefore, the pasuk says, ultimately, again, its insides and its waist remains inside. My Talmudus, what are we learning? The same way that waist remains on the inside of the animal, so too again the kishkas remain on the inside of the animal as well. The Tanya and Rabbi says, Ne'emar kan ar ubasar. It says over here, ar and basar. So the Gemara says, Amud Beis, v'ne'emar lahalon ar ubasar. And it says by the par kohen masher. So now watch what we're doing is, right? Remember, all of this is, once you learn out B from A, we now want to use B to go ahead and serve as a source of something else. So it says over here, by the par kohen gadol, ultimately again, ar and basar, v'ne'emar lahalon. And it says by the par kohen mashiach, ar and basar. Sorry, v'ne'emar lahalon, ar baso perish. And it says by the par kohen gadol, flesh, skin, flesh, and waist. Malahalon ayidei nituach shelo behefshit. Just like ultimately again over there, we remove the sacrificial parts without cutting up the animal. Afkan ayidei nituach shelo behefshit. So too over here, we ultimately again will go ahead and remove the sacrificial parts without cutting up the animal. So we'll say, what have we just done? We've just learned out a secondary gezerah shava from a first gezerah shava. B was learned out from a par kohen gadol, ultimately again was learned out from Ola through a Gzera Shava, and then ultimately again par kohen Mashiach was ultimately learned out from another Gzera Shava. So we learned out a Gzera Shava from a Gzera Shava. Incredible. So it says, therefore again, it sounds like ultimately you're allowed to do this. Again, you'll just keep in the back of your mind, all of this stands in contradistinction, ultimately, the statement of Rabbi Yochanan that we saw before, that when it comes to Kachim, we do not learn out derivative halachas. Obviously, all of this is against Rabbi Yochanan, which we'll have to discuss. And I will say, at this point in the shir, you may be asking yourself, right, what is going on over here, right? Just like, so we'll say, I just want to point out why a sugya like this is incredibly important. In life, the process is just as important as the finish line. Right? We often like to focus that as long as the job is complete, at the end of the day, who cares how you got there? And that is fundamentally false. The process is just as important, and dare I say, even more important than ultimately the completion or the actualization or the finish line of the task. Why? Because it is often the process, ultimately, again, that builds us as people. It's the process that builds character, it's the process that builds stamina, and it's the process that builds resolve. On a very basic level, it's the process that determines everything. Imagine for a moment there's someone you love and you're giving them a gift. Right, whatever it is, a spouse, a sibling, a friend. So imagine for a moment, you've given this mashal many times, you take the gift, and you go to your wife and you say, here, happy birthday, right? Go knock yourself out, right? Happy birthday. Right? The gift could be the most exquisite gift in the world, most beautiful gift in the world, right? But if the process through which that gift has been given is flawed, the gift is rendered fundamentally meaningless. Now let's say, what makes Torah beautiful and meaningful? It's a willingness to toil in it, and a willingness to toil even when I don't necessarily know what's happening every moment, and even when I'm wondering to myself, why do I have to do this? You ever have a conversation with someone who you love very much? Perhaps it's a spouse, and you're wondering to yourself, why are we having this conversation, right? Maybe we've spoken about this 50 times already. We've had the same exact conversation over and over and over. And you're ready to say what? Right, no one's going to go on record saying this, right? I don't know. You're ready to say, we spoke about this. Yeah, and yes, actually, like, I agree with you. Like we're not even on opposite sides. I said I agree. I said you're right. I said I'm sorry. Just give me a moment over here. We did this. We did this already. Yet everyone knows relationship building 101. You need to do it as many times as it takes. Because that's part of the process of building relationship. It's part of the process of building security. It's part of the process, ultimately, again, of building dialogue. Because it's not just about, okay, we did this, tackless, mission accomplished, next. The process is so profoundly important. Because then when, at some point in time later on, having that same conversation 50 times builds that relationship muscle, builds the foundation. And at some point in time, when you need to lean on that foundation because something is really difficult and challenging, you have all of that buildup of that foundation. It's the same thing in Torah. Whether you recognize it or not, Rabbi Shmuel, working through this sugya, and yes, Rabbi Shmuel, I just want to point out, because I know what happens for all of us, and I'd be in the same boat if I did not give the shir. At a certain point in time, you're like, I'm out. And either I'm literally doing something else, I start learning something else, I'm focusing on something else, and I will get back in when there's something reasonably meaningful and helpful that's going to come my way. I will say, if you do that, just understand you're missing out on some of the key parts of the relationship. This whole Gemara is about process. Process is often the driest part of relationships. Process is often the most unexciting parts of relationships. Process is often the parts that are like, are we done yet? Can we please get to something else? But without it, you are fundamentally unprepared to build on that relationship going forward. That's what this is. This is literally process 101. Can you learn this? It's not complicated. A little bit dry, but don't blame that on Chazal. You can blame that on me, right? A little bit dry, but so profoundly necessary, both for Gemara, our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how we address the fundamental processes in all areas of our life. So with that, let's dig back in. Third line from the top of the number base. So ultimately, the Gemara says, listen to this. If something is learned out from Gzera Shava, right? So again, B is learned out from A with Gzera Shava. Can B then serve as a Kal V'chomer with C? So we're just asking the same question in multiple different iterations. So the Gemara says, Kal V'chomer. So the Gemara says, of course you can. It's a Kal V'chomer you can, which is so interesting. Kal V'chomer, Uma Hekesh, She'enu Malamed, Behekesh, So I'll say one of the things we've established is if B is learned out from a hekish with A, B can serve as a hekish with C. Now that was learned out from one of two pieces. That was in yesterday's daf, either from Rava or from Ravina. If B is learned out from a hekish with A, B can serve as a kal v'chomer with C. Now that we learned in yesterday, or we just learned, the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, as we just learned from Tad Rabbi Shmuel. That's what we just saw before in Amud Aleph. So the Gemara says, Gzera Shava, Hamilamedes beHekesh Midra Papa. So the Gzera Shava can be learned from a Hekesh. In other words, if B is learned from A with a Hekesh, with Gzera Shava, can then serve as a source of a Hekesh. That's Rav Papa. Of course, it can be used as a Kal V'chomer. Interesting. So the Gemara wants to answer this up with the Kal V'chomer, that we learn from a Kal V'chomer that if B is learned out from A, ultimately, again, with the Gzera Shava, ultimately, again, B could serve as a Kal V'chomer with C. Incredible. So that makes sense if you subscribe to the view of Rav Papa. But ultimately, again, if you don't subscribe to Rav Papa, what is there to say? Ella Kal V'chomer. The Gemara says it's a Kal V'chomer. It's fascinating. The Gemara is using a Kal V'chomer to teach us ultimately, again, exegetical processes. Uma hekish she'in malamed behekish. So remember again, if something is learned out by dint of a hekish, it cannot serve as the source of a hekish for something else. So if B is learned out from a comparison with A, so B can't serve as a primary comparison for C. So the Gemara says, imid Rava, imid Ravina. So that's based on the sources that we saw in yesterday's daf, Rava or Ravina. Yet again, something learned out from a hekish, Melame b'Kal V'chomer. can serve as the source of a kavachomer. Where did we learn that from? Midatan de Rabbi Shmuel. That's what we just saw. Gzera shava hamelamedes begzera shava chaverta. So ultimately, again, a gzera shava, which can be learned out from another gzera shava. Where did we see that from? Midrami bar Chama. Rabbi said this is all today's daf. As we learned from Rabbi Chama, Einodin shetlan bekavachomer could certainly serve as the source for a kavachomer. So if a gzera shava, right, if something like that from a gzera shava could serve as part of another gzera shava, then certainly something like that from a gzera shava could ultimately be used as part of a kavachomer. Incredible. So the Gemara answered from a kavachomer. Fascinating. Next, davar halamim begzera shava. And I will say, by the way, I'll just point out, for us, obviously, these conversations don't have that much applicability. Why? Because we're not the ones making the drashas. But understand, for the Gemara, this is the bread and butter of Talmudic discourse. Because remember, both say this is talking about the mechanics through which you could learn things out. So these principles are pretty, again, for us, like I said, we're not making the drashas. So for me, I'm just like, tell me what we do. Just bottom line, like tell me what we could learn. But for Chazal sitting in the base medrash, trying to understand, well, if B is learned that from A through a kavachomer, can I use it for a hekesh? Can I use it for gzera shava? This is it. This literally, again, Rabbi say, this is where the magic, if you know what that feeling you're feeling, that's the magic happening, right? That is the magic happening, right? So, because again, this is exactly how we answer this determines how pretty much like the rest of Shas is going to be structured. Incredible. Next, Darvalam B'Gzera Shava, Mao Shilam Binyanav. So I'll say, interesting enough, if something is learned out from Gzera Shava, can it serve as a paradigm? So if B is learned out from A with a Gzera Shava, can B then serve as a Binyan Av a paradigm? Tish Gemara says, Teku. Interesting. Yeah, okay. Next, Darvalam B'Kavachomer, Mao Shilam B'Hekish. If something's learned out from a kavachomer, it says B is learned out from A with a kavachomer. So ultimately, again, can B be used with C as a hekish? So the Gemara says, Mid Rabbi Yochanan, Malamid behekish. I'm sorry, Mid Rabbi Yochanan, Malamid behekish, Mid Rabbi Papa. So the Gemara says, yeah, Beis Rabbi Yochanan, Beis Rabbi Papa. The kavachomer halamid behekish, Meditana de Rabbi Shmuel. So what's this? There's a kavachomer that is learned out from a hekish. Ultimately, again, from Rabbi Shmuel. The Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Kavachomer halam behekish, midtan Rabbi Shmuel. Eino din shilam behekish. So hanicha l'man d'isay d'Rapapa. That works fine. Ultimately, again, if you subscribe to the view of Rapapa, el l'man d'lesle d'Rapapa ma'ika l'meimar. But if you don't subscribe to Rapapa, I will say again, this is all just mentioning all of the shitas that we have seen in the last 2 days. So what is there to say? Teku. Well, use it as a teku. Okay. Next. If something is learned out from a kavachomer, so we'll say, so B is learned out from A with a kavachomer, can B then serve as the source or as part of a gzera shava with C? To which the Gemara says, it's kavachomer. Interesting. The Gemara says, yes. The answer is yes, based on a kavachomer. Or I should say, the answer could be found based on a kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Uma gzera shava she'ena lameida behekesha. So we'll say, since this, so something out from a gzera shava. If something is learned out from a gzera shava, it cannot be used as part of a hekish. Mid Rabbi Yochanan, and that's based on Rabbi Yochanan. Yet melamed b'gzera shava midrai bar Chama. Yet Rabbi says something learned out from a gzera shava can be used as the source of another gzera shava. That's right, bar Chama. Therefore, kavachomer halamed behekish. Therefore, kavachomer ultimately again. A kavachomer learned out by a hekish. Midtai Rabbi Shmuel. Certainly can serve as the source ultimately again for a gzera shava. So therefore, again, I will say based on that, the Gemara says that something learned out from a kavachomer ultimately again can be used as the source for a gzera shava. Fascinating. One more piece, I will say. The Gemara says davar halamed, davar bekavachomer. So we'll say, interesting question. If B is learned out from A with a kavachomer, can B then serve as the source of a kavachomer, part of a kavachomer with C? So the Gemara says, the Gemara answers, kavachomer. It's a kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? Uma gzer shava shein l'meida behekish made Rabbi Yochanan. So if a gzer shava, right, something like that from a gzer shava, ultimately again cannot be used as a hekish. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Malayim kavachomer yet can be used as a source for a kavachomer. Kida amran, as we said, kavachomer halamed mehekish. So ultimately, again, if a kavachomer, something learned out from a kavachomer, ultimately again can be used as part of a hekish. Meaning, the time of Rabbi Shmuel, as we saw the time of Rabbi Shmuel, Eino din shilami b'kavachomer. Ultimately, again, certainly can be used as or be learned from a kavachomer as well. The zel kavachomer ben kavachomer. And I will say, interestingly enough, this is what we call a kavachomer ben a kavachomer. So you see from here that a double kavachomer ultimately works. The Gemara says, well, in reality, ben benoshal kavachomer hu. In reality, I will say, this is actually what you just mentioned, actually a 3-tier kavachomer. Ella kavachomer. Right, the Gemara says it's the kavachomer. What's the kavachomer? And I will say, remember again, the Gemara is asking over here, something learned out. That's the Gemara's question. If something is learned out from a kavachomer, can it then serve as a part of another kavachomer? If B is learned out from A with a kavachomer, can B then go ahead and ultimately serve as a kavachomer with C? The Gemara says that's a kavachomer. Ma hekish sheino lomed behekish. If B is learned out from A with a hekish, right? Ultimately, again, B cannot serve as a hekish with C. That's one of the things we've already established. And that's based either on Rava or Ravina. Yet melamid b'kavachomer. Yet if B is derived from A with a hekish, B can serve as a kavachomer with C. Meitan Rabbi Shmuel, kavachomer halamed mehekish. So all the more. So something from hekish. Meitan Rabbi Shmuel, eino din sheyalamed b'kavachomer. Ultimately, again, certainly could be learned from a kavachomer. Vezel kavachomer ben kavachomer. So we'll say, interestingly enough, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, I shouldn't say halacha l'maisa. Based on what the Gemara is saying over here, is that if B is learned out from a kavachomer with A, then ultimately, again, B can serve as a kavachomer, ultimately, again, with C. Next, davar kavachomer, mashlam binyan av. So we'll say, next question. If B is learned out from a kavachomer, ultimately, again, with A, so again, can that kavachomer ultimately, again, then serve as a binyan av? What's a binyan av? A binyan av is a paradigm. We loosely translate it as a paradigm, right? It creates a paradigm, and therefore anything else that kind of fits in that paradigmatic framework will share the same halacha. But if you remember again, we started with this, and this was the beginning of today's daf. Right, they wanted to suggest that maybe like chatos, right? Chatos becomes like a paradigm for sin offerings, and therefore asham will automatically be included in that paradigm as well. So now the Gemara switches gears a little bit. Well, you start to say the Gemara says, if B is learned out from a kavachomer, if B is learned out by dint of a kavachomer, can B then serve as a paradigm for C? Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tashma malak v'nimtzeis treifa. So it's an interesting case over here. Let's say the coin did malika, and ultimately, and we'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem. We'll pick up with this. So we'll say, so I just want to point out, we're almost finished with this. We are almost finished in this, right? We're almost finished. We have. So tomorrow's daf. We have one more little piece with this. Just, I know it feels like we've been through every single exegetical combination possibly known to man. There's actually 2 more left. We'll get to those tomorrow, Emirat Hashem. We will then see the halacha l'maisa on this, and then Emirat Hashem get back to our regular sugya. And we'll say shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone. All about